Hi, Stefanie Drysdale here. We wanted to take a little time to have a little special guest come talk to you all today. The topic is gonna be all out and a little extra. It's gonna be the hospitality industry and how the COVID crisis has impacted that. So for our special guest today, I've asked Mark Sanna, who's one of our senior advisors here at Prescient, and also the managing director at NorthPoint International, to come talk to us. And just kind of give us a little insight into the whole COVID situation as it relates to the hospitality industry. So, besides the obvious growing risk of infections, there are some emergent security complications for hotels during the COVID crisis. So, one example would be like potential data breach vulnerabilities and mass layoffs and financial instability and those types of things. Um, what types of security implications do you see, and how that impacts the security of the hospitality industry?
I think in the near term, the most persistent risk is the risk of reinfection. So as we work our way through, and at some point people begin traveling again, having strong protocols around the protection of the hotel workforce to not be reinfected from a guest or to reinfect each other locally. So how are we going to handle that going forward? Currently, the methodologies are kind of zero tolerance, but going forward, we're going to have to adapt to something that says self-quarantine, temperature taking, a whole new protocol for admitting people into the properties, for managing the workforce, et cetera. I think the second major challenge coming out of this will be rebuilding the workforce, because the longer staff is laid off, they'll seek employment opportunities elsewhere. And it may be a challenge of rebuilding the workforce um, as travelers begin to resume their travel. The more persistent threat long term is one related to terrorism, the potential for terrorists now to capitalize on the use of um, biohazards, chemicals, and virals to create attack vectors. And it may necessitate creating a new program within the hospitality industry, very much akin to what Homeland Security developed for the food industry, the food defense program. So that may mean the adaptation of travel apps, tracking apps that will become integrated into the registration process and create a more holistic picture of what flight did you arrive on, where are you staying, how can we get a hold of you. A bit, it's going to require management around privacy, but I think there's going to be many countries that begin to stand up those kind of travel tracking integrated applications for travelers. In the hospitality industry, it will be folded into the registration process, I think. So I think going forward, that's kind of the big transformative picture that's likely to unfold.
Excellent. So to piggyback on that, in addition to the travel tracking and those different registration processes, do you see any other potential changes to the industry going forward? Because I
Sure.
think we've established there has to be a new normal. So what do you think that new normal looks like?
Well, that's a good way to frame it, because I don't think we're going to go back to the way it was. I think we are
Mm,
going to redefine a new normal, and I think it's going to cause a complete rethink of the business practices. Yes, reassessment of your supply chain and supply chain vulnerability, a look at your crisis management and incident response protocols, but more systemically, I think it's going to look at how we manage public spaces, um, incorporating kind of the new norms of social distancing and hygiene. Um, it's really going to, I think, redefine itself in meetings and events, the planning for them, again, that part of travel tracking, the registration of all participants into that. Um, I don't know, but it could actually even spell out into some tighter access control protocols. You see them already in places in Southeast Asia with temperature testing before people allow in. it may evolve into some other forms of access control into hotels that heretofore hasn't been there, even to mitigate terrorism, except in high threat locations. I think the whole concept of vulnerability exposure from a traveler is going to redefine, and build a incremental approach. So you travel by plane, you got in a cab, you came to the hotel, you ate at a restaurant, understanding potentially those vectors of infection and how they can be correlated if you become ill, if you begin to reinfect people on the back end of this. So I think the hotel industry is going to start rethinking a lot of that and how it fits into the overall travel industry as a component of a potential threat vector within that greater hospitality industry.
Excellent. So again, to build on that, when we're talking about the overall hospitality industry, and we start talking about short-term rentals and things like Airbnbs, how do you see this pandemic impacting those more gig economy type things with the short-term rentals?
Well, I think in the near term, there's going to certainly be corporate travelers and others who are hyper concerned about the hygiene practices and uh, and do not want to put themselves at risk. And I think because of that, they potentially will have greater reliability on the hospitality sector, hotels, because they know our brand standards. They can refer to our hygiene practices, et cetera. I'm sure Airbnb will address this, but I think in the traveler's mind, you don't know who stayed there before you. You don't know, how well the residence was cleaned, to what degree it was cleaned, et cetera. So I think there'll be a period of adjustments for companies like Airbnb to create a program of assurance around the hygiene practice. I think companies like Safe Hotels that do hotel inspections will adapt their protocols as well to provide greater assurance around hygiene and hygiene practices. Heretofore, it's all been physical security, maybe data privacy security. I think now it's going to start to include some element of hygiene into those kind of security assurance reviews.
Excellent. So to pivot off of that, when we hear about hotels recently that are being converted into like short-term clinics, what are the trade-offs for the operators right now? And should us as consumers, should we be worried about staying in these hotels once general travel resumes? Or would it be a little bit like the Airbnb thing with the cleanliness and this, the hygiene?
Yeah, it's a good question. For me as a practitioner, and particularly around crisis management, one of the things NorthPoint specializes in, it comes back to perception, people's perceptions, and building a confidence in the hygiene practices within the hotel. So I think the challenge around, well, there's two parts of that question. First, in some locations, the government, in effect, takes over the hotel because they need it for as part of their response plan. I think for most hotels, we have tried to serve as what I'll call the 14-day respite center versus a quarantine center. Okay, in the public's mind, I don't think they have a lot of issue around people who may need to self-quarantine because they're a traveler and they're going someplace before they can enter that workplace. They have to go through, this period of quarantine, which may be reduced to 5 days. I don't know, but hotels having protocols in place to be able to serve as that respite center is a much different perspective than a quarantine hotel where you're actually treating people medically. Hotels aren't licensed to do that. They're not set up to do that. So I think those are actions of ultimate last resort in highly, highly impacted areas. And I think most hotels for brand and reputational considerations, are trying to be helpful with the respite center capacity versus the quarantine center capacity. We'd rather leave that into the medical domain. Um, we will have to deal with it, much like the cruise industry is going to have to deal with it. People are going to need, again, because of perception, a much higher level of assurance around the sanitation of the ships, the hygiene practices aboard ship, what's changed post COVID-19 world in the cruise industry. So the good news is I think we'll all align as part of the hospitality industry. Airlines are going to have to consider this, cruise ships, hotels. It's going to spread itself across the entire hospitality industry. But we will come to some protocol to assure travelers of the integrity of the hygiene of the hotel. That's for sure.
Yeah, those are great points. I think it's really important that you called out that the hotels are not designed to be hospitals, and they're not even, they're not built that way. So I think that's a great point. So if I'm a business person and I'm traveling, what are some things that I should do while I'm traveling to various hotels to ensure my own safety as well as I can?
I I come back to what I said earlier. I think you have to take, this is why I kind of call this all out. You have to take an all out mentality, which means you've kind of got to put you've got to put yourself and your personal protection first. So if that means wearing gloves, wearing a mask while you're traveling aboard an aircraft, if it means in public spaces doing that, you're going to have to do it. Okay, and you should do it. You should follow those guidelines, washing hands frequently, using hand sanitizer, carrying it with you, protecting yourself. Because the challenge you have as a traveler isn't so much per se the hotel, it's that the itinerary, if you will, the full itinerary from beginning to end. Getting in a cab, going to the airport, traveling on a plane, getting in a cab, going to a restaurant, going to a hotel. You don't know where you could be infected or become infected. So yes, we are a piece of that, but and we will do our part in terms of the cleanliness and hygiene of the hotel. But a traveler's got to do their part about being unabashed about protecting themselves and caring for themselves. And this is another part where if they become ill, not wasting time to either begin to medicate or get it checked so that they don't become violently ill and potentially at risk in a foreign location. Okay. So it's a new way of thinking about travel, very much like how people are thinking in the current domain about going grocery shopping. You have
Yes.
to act a little differently going grocery shopping today than you did last week. So, and I think there'll be some residual practices that will carry over. May not be as extreme as it is right now, but it will change, and the traveler is going to have to adapt to those kind of changes.
Excellent. Just to kind of put a final cap on it, uh, what do you recommend for great sources of information? We've had some talks lately about political leanings when it comes to this kind of information. How do you choose where you get your information and who you trust when it comes to something this important?
Well, let me start with one of the things that I do see changing is the creation of more forums and more platforms for information sharing. I think one of the good things around this pandemic is there has been greater inclination to share information, exchange information, and people are looking for good forums. NorthPoint, the company that I'm with, created a global platform to be able to do that within the hospitality sector. One of the changes that we're evolving into is it was originally created for security people, but we are opening it up to event planners, to meeting planners, to corporate travel people, because they need to be engaged in those conversations as well. They have a thirst for the same kind of information. So for me personally, I start with what information am I looking for. In the pandemic, I do rely on Johns Hopkins and platforms like the World Health and the CDC. but there are many organizations like ISMA and As Is and others, and private companies, and Prescient. This comes back to an area where Prescient may have also involved in terms of travel tracking, creating a platform for travel tracking, that integrated approach for a traveler that a corporate's going to want to know too going forward. So I think one of the big changes will be around more forums, more information sharing forums, platforms, means to do that.
Excellent. No, travel intel's a huge piece of it. I totally agree.
Yeah,
Well, I
and
appreciate
it
so
and it's
much you
going
taking
to
time to
it's
come.
going to I'm sorry, it's going to
What, I'm sorry?
evolve from it's going to evolve just from travel tracking, like knowing where someone is, to more of what I'll say a travel history that a corporate travel department may want to sustain to be able to, include potentially vaccinations, other measures that play into that travel profile. So I think it's going to evolve from just tracking to a more robust understanding of a travel history format. So, and I also wanted to say just one final thought. We're evolving kind of into a pilgrimage, for lack of a better term. We're not going back to the way it was. We're going to define a new normal. And that's a pilgrimage that's going to lead us to that new normal. And I think for many of my colleagues, it's going to require courage in an effort to act boldly. The way forward will need bold measures to be able to globally implement them at a local level. It's going to require compassion. It's going to require some tolerance. And most of all, I think it's going to require imagination. I look at where we're at today, and I think it's a great opportunity to really use our creative natures to rebuild the new normal, to redefine it. So I'm very kind of excited about it in a way that it has created this opportunity for us that I hope we capitalize on.
I hope so too. I appreciate
Yeah,
so much you taking time to come talk to us.
I appreciate the opportunity. So thank you.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank
Thanks
you.
all.